So, Chris, earlier this week, we of course had WWDC, and we're not going to talk about all the announcements in terms of iOS or some of the features that are coming. We're more interested in Apple's approach overall to how they executed the models on device, what sort of models are being offered at the device level, what's happening in this announcement around private cloud compute. So we wanted to dig into those details. Before we do, though, I thought what was most interesting about this announcement was how they seem to have built features around actual problems that AI can solve, unlike other tech demo conferences we've seen before, where you watch it and you say, I've never had that problem. They seem very much grounded in the reality of what AI can do today. We saw things like writing tools I'll bring up on the screen now for those watching, the ability to just create custom pictures in messages with really easy prompting, the ability to create custom emojis, and various other features that seem, probably boring to a lot of us that have been following AI for quite some time and have been using all this stuff, but probably pretty magical and great for end users of iPhones. What did you make of the Apple Intelligence announcement?
It seems like the in-app features are just that, like minor incremental things that just give you a taste of that sort of stuff. But the more significant things are what you mentioned at the start, which are the on-device models being able to run and being made available to app developers, and then the larger model, which is being made available in Apple's private cloud offering, which is also available to developers to do more with. So I feel like the user-facing stuff is like quite gimmicky and just like an incremental thing. But like you say, for people who haven't experienced that, it's good. It's also in context. So because it has your user context, it's obviously more useful than having to copy paste stuff into ChatGPT. So it will be a good experience for the users. But I think really this is a step towards Apple really being an AI heavy interface. But it's just being put out there to app developers to go, okay, now here you go. Here's the stuff. Go build something with it.
I remember in the very early days of this podcast, one of the things we kept saying is this is going to be in everything. It's going to be in everything. And we, I think there's a clip of one of those shorts of us saying that. And really, that's what we saw from this announcement. They've built it into every single place on Earth in iOS that they could. And I would say it's not too dissimilar to what we've seen from Microsoft or even Android devices. Of course, there's Samsung AI, which has a lot of similar features. But I think what's really interesting about their approach here is they've built these very specialized, or a singular, specialized model on the actual device itself that's running most of these experiences. And then we get these fine-tuned adapters, which are really delivering those key experiences, whether it's in messaging or the image generation itself.
We discussed this many times on our podcast about the idea that the future is going to be lots of small, specialized models for purpose, because once a model is capable of solving a particular problem, you don't need a massive generalist model that can do everything. It makes more sense to run one, doesn't rely on the internet, doesn't have to send your personal data hither and yon. It just works and it just does the task in the context. So I think it makes total sense they've gone down this path. It also makes sense why we've seen in the open source space, even by the larger companies, this emphasis on always having a smaller version of their model out there for benchmarking, testing, and all that sort of stuff, because they knew this was coming. We all knew that on device was going to be the real thing for the app developers that mattered.
Yeah, what I think is fascinating about this announcement too, behind the scenes, and what's interesting is they didn't really cover this in the WWDC main keynote. We got a lot of these details after. In particular, I'm referring to this article on their website, in their machine learning research unit, introducing Apple's on-device and server foundation models. And it was really this article that we got a lot of information about what's going on behind the scenes. Do you want to talk about just their approach to the model and what they've done that's unique here?
Yeah, so the on-device model is fairly easy to understand. They've got a 3 billion parameter model that's running on the actual phone. and that will have some user context available from your situation, plus whatever the app specifically is trying to do. And that can answer simpler questions. When that model is not capable or whatever, it's just not able to perform the task at hand, they then have a larger model that is running on servers that they control. And so Apple's private cloud servers are running on Apple Silicon, which is interesting in its own right. So they're not relying on NVIDIA at all for this. And additionally, that model is a larger one. Now, they don't mention, as far as I can see, anywhere in the article what that larger model entails, only that they've trained it using their own open source technique that they make available. Obviously, not the weights, but the technique they use to train it. They also mentioned that it's all trained on licensed data. So, like, there's none of this just crawl Reddit kind of stuff going on. They've paid for everything that they've
Well,
trained
that's
it
not
on.
entirely true because they do say with Applebot they crawled the web. So you don't really know what they've crawled.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. But anyway, the point is that they've got a larger model, but there's no details of it. Now, this article about the private cloud goes into a lot of details of all of the lengths they have gone to protect this thing. So they've got things like an independent inspector inspecting the hardware before they install it in the data server. They've got encryption at every single level. The servers run in a stateless way. There's no command shell on the servers. Like, they really, really hammer home the point that this thing is secure, right? Like, they really want you to, the take home message to be the Apple private AI cloud, or whatever you want to call it, private cloud compute is rock solid security. Now, the reason they want to do that is because they are sending your personal information off to this thing, or will be, as part of various apps on your phone that are going to run. So when a larger model is called for, it's going to bundle up your context information, like your personal details, whatever the data happens to be, send it off to this cloud thing for inference, and then get the result back. So I think this is why that article is so security focused, because they want to send the message that, don't worry, trust us, guys, this is fine.
And to be clear here, this is not going off to ChatGPT because obviously before this event, the rumors were they're just going to use ChatGPT or they might use Gemini by Google. But this is indeed their own model running on their own private servers with their own silicon and with this security guarantee around it.
Yeah, and I'm surprised they didn't emphasize that more in their announcement. But I think this just further emphasizes my point from the start that I feel like for Apple, this is just a foothold, like a step in the right direction. And then what we're going to see from here on out is a developer focus on building apps that leverage their private AI cloud.
I think this focus on privacy and security is so smart because obviously no one on earth trusts OpenAI. Like zero trust, I think, to well, I certainly don't, but and I think a lot of people would share that view that they just seem untrustworthy just by the way they've operated, whether or not that's true or not. But they even released details this week about how, they'll only train on data when you're not in one of these private sessions or if you've explicitly opted out and you're on this plan or that plan. It's just very confusing how and when your data is not potentially being used to train. And I know myself from using ChatGPT occasionally, sometimes I'll slip up and not put it into like a private or secure mode, paste some code in, and all of a sudden that code's out there in the wild to be trained on. Not very good code, but it is out there to be trained on. And so I think that's been a hesitation by a lot of companies and a lot of people to go more all in with AI or use it a lot more. They feel like their work's being stolen or the private conversations they have with AI might be used in a way to train future iterations of these models. Apple's coming out and saying, no, this is private, secure, and it's baked in at an OS level.
And I think with Apple, that they're in it for the long haul. The problem with a lot of the AI public APIs right now is they're changing so rapidly because the technology's changing that it's really unclear what's going to keep existing, what's their play going to be. Everyone I speak to is sort of like that, where it's like the models can change out from under you. They might deprecate the model. They might remove an API. It's really unclear how you should build on it. And it seems like most people are building their apps like that rely on AI in a dynamic way where you can just swap out models to whatever the current latest best one is, or whatever the cheapest is, or whatever you're optimizing for. There's no sort of, okay, I'm going to go all in on this vendor and build customized to that. And indeed, even in the programming interfaces, we're seeing them converge around a sort of similar interface. So it's extremely easy just to swap them out. Whereas Apple's different in the sense that there's a lot of money and there's a lot of I guess just trust in their ecosystem that if you build on this infrastructure and the new libraries they're providing, you'll be supported for long into the future. So I think Apple's far different in that respect to the incumbent AI providers, even though their model might not be as good.
I think it's also worth talking about the fact that these app intents that they speak about in this Apple intelligence layer. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of iOS developers that are listening saying, hey, we've had app intents for a long time. These are things that help you do the Apple shortcuts, if you ever use those, where you can chain a series of intents together between apps to get things done. I don't personally think it's that widely adopted. It's like a pretty nerdy feature to do automation on your phone. But it seems like this Apple Intelligence and future promise of Siri, again, yet another big tech company talking about like, in the future with Siri, you'll be able to. But I think until we see it working with these app intents and chaining them together successfully, like function calling that we talk about on the show all the time, we won't know if it's effective or not. But I would assume, Apple being Apple, is they will make it just work to some length. So I'm super curious to see how app intents plays out. But what they're essentially doing, I think, with this WWDC is saying to developers, hey, go put these app intents in, and then next year we'll probably see this in reality.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's quite an intelligent approach again from Apple in the respect that they realize that to properly automate things with AI, like the usefulness comes from personal context, so it knows like who you've spoken to recently, what you've spoken about, where you've visited, like all that context. I mean, ignore the sinister side for a minute, but given that we have our lives in our phones, if it knows all about that, the next logical step is getting that information into the tools that you use in day-to-day life. And that's where the true value comes. Like I can think from a transport perspective, if your calendar knows you need to get to this destination, you want to use public transport, it can load up, hey, here's your bus options, here's your train options, whatever it is. And so I think that it requires the cooperation of the app developers, because Apple can't possibly know all of the different tools and things that are available. And creating some generic AI that's just like using the phone like a human would and just henpecking around and trying to figure it out for itself is unrealistic. So having the app intents cooperate in a way that's universally understandable by the phone and therefore by the AI is going to really, really put them in a powerful position for that, like the vision of Siri that we've always had and always wanted.
Sorry, the henpecking comment got me for some reason. I don't know why. It really aptly describes those interfaces and the AI today as it's clicking through software. More on that.
And it's one of the reasons why I don't really like Apple personally, is like the idea that once you're in a specific app, you're in it, and like context switching isn't really a thing you can do very well on Apple compared to Android. But this sort of overcomes all of that, because then your universal app will be Siri, and you'll just sort of direct it as to what you want to do.
People have talked about new hardware, obviously, for AI and how it will change the interaction you have with devices. Like it'll be AI first. It does seem like this is setting up Apple or whatever devices in your pocket in the future from them to be like an orchestration layer over your life, where it is able to go and execute things using these app intents. You could imagine a world in the future, and this is by no means an original thought, but you can imagine in the future, these app intents are the sort of hooks that developers put in. Like there's no longer app interfaces or a need for them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like we think about a lot of the things that we saw with like GPTs, for example. The biggest challenge is, how do you get access to all the various APIs to actually do useful things with the sort of classification, summarization, ability for the AI to sort of create data types that work with whatever. The issue then becomes you need APIs that support that. But really, there's an app for everything. There's an app for that. So really, it just becomes like a universal API, really. And it's kind of an interesting interface of how the AI can not only do useful things in your life, but ultimately take over the world.
We'll talk about it a little bit later. There's some new research that's out that Ethan Mollick shared on Twitter that I'm interested in discussing. And one of the things in that report is around how people are using AI but not really talking about it. And we've mentioned that on the show before, that like a lot of people use it, but they don't really say, oh, I used AI for this, or I'm using AI. They're just sort of using it as like this secret weapon or this personal interaction with technology that they're having. And they don't really see it as using AI in that traditional sense.
Yeah, just like you don't go like, I just want to give credit to Microsoft Word for the really productive day I just had.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think with Apple Intelligence, one of the things that could work really well in their favor is that personal relationship you have with your phone. Like it's in your pocket, it's on you all the time, it's with you.
It's in the toilet.
Yeah. But then there's like the privacy element of that. Now they're coming out and for years they've been conditioning Apple users to think, well, this is like the most secure private thing. Like we're not selling your data, you're not the product, et cetera, et cetera. And now this may turn around and pay off in the sense that you want that secure personal relationship with AI in the future. If your phone is like the hub of this knowledge about your life, it's the eyes from which you sort of share your world with through photos and video. It's got all your emails, your calendar, all that kind of stuff on it. You can really see them easily, without the best model necessarily, being able to win this race towards a very personalized assistant that can help you.
Yeah, like because there's all those stories about where, the FBI is trying to use like lasers and like modern techniques and all this stuff to crack iPhone's encryption to get, evidence for legal cases, and they can't do it. So they have a stellar reputation when it comes to that kind of data security.
What do you put so obviously you can have an episode of the show like this after an event and you start fantasizing and getting a little bit ahead of where things are at. Do you think in a year from now I can say to Siri, hey, go find me like 6 destinations for my next vacation, or like, look at this leather jacket and track it down, as is always the demos of these things? Or do you think that's just like still too far ahead?
No, I don't think that's too far ahead. I think that if tool calling becomes a thing where the apps can provide what tools they have available, and the Siri is able to coordinate the input data to run those tools, it's not far-fetched that we'll see an absolute ton of applications of it. Like we won't even be able to understand how many possible applications there are, because there's apps for everything. So I actually think it'll probably go further than that. I don't think maybe like e-commerce shopping's a bit different because there's personal preferences involved. But in terms of things we use apps for, so for example, my kids have a soccer game tomorrow. I'd love to be able to ask the phone, hey, what time's the soccer game on? Now, that sounds easy, but it isn't a matter of just searching Google. You've got to go, the school has its own app. You've got to go in there. You've got to go to like co-curricular, navigate into this thing. Now, that's time consuming right now. Whereas it will be able to answer questions like that, assuming the app developer makes those app intents available. And there'd be so many niche apps like that for different businesses and different commercial applications, where just by providing those app intents, you've suddenly got a context-aware personal assistant that can do all this stuff. If anything, it makes you want to develop more apps because it's just such a useful interface that you always have with you.
What about apps that rely on attention, like having you in their app? So I'm thinking like a social network, right? They're trying to sell you ads. Like me being in the Facebook or Instagram app or TikTok app is how they make their money. Like they want to keep you contained in this
So
app.
they just need Siri to have a way to give you like depression and bad sleep automatically, so you don't have to bother with the social media.
How will I doom scroll with the new Siri? But seriously, like there's no incentive for a lot of these developers, like Airbnb even. Like, is there incentive to work with app intents? I guess there is, because they earn commissions off bookings. They're not really worried about eyeballs. It seems to suit those like service booking based businesses a lot better than say social networks. But I guess with social networks, it's like you don't really want Siri like posting on your behalf or you know.
Yeah, and as we discussed this morning, like I think I see social media as a form of recreation. I just like reading it from time to time. So I don't know if it necessarily changes those use cases very much, but there's just so many where it will, and it'll make it actually really useful. I think it's a genuinely good thing.
So one of the interesting things about this announcement was everyone was really expecting them to come out and say, we're using ChatGPT for everything. Isn't summer great? AGI next week. And that's indeed not really what happened. I thought, if anything, this was almost you could say that the integration is a nod to the fact that people do want to access better models. But it's also just about commoditizing these model providers. I mean, they literally said after the event, we're hoping to get Google Gemini in there as an option soon. And they're also, we know from leaks, talking to Anthropic as well. So it seems like for these creative or maybe like code-based models where they're just not competitive right now, they're happy to obviously asking you for permission to go and do this, but send your data off to a larger model to get a response, and you'll be able to pick and choose the model that you want to use. And maybe that's the one you have a paid subscription to, that higher level of paid intelligence. But I don't know about you. I sort of see it like when they originally integrated Google Maps and then they just went and built their own maps and over time improved it. It feels to me like eventually they'll just put that in their private cloud compute as well and cut those models off completely.
Yeah, like they've sort of acknowledged that we can't win on this front at the moment, so we'll temporarily make a deal, sort of like Hitler did with Russia, and then when the time is right, just turn on them.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's necessarily a good or bad thing for OpenAI. I think in the short term, it's a good thing because it exposes so many people, so many more people to ChatGPT. And if they start using it and like it, and there's an upgrade path to a premium subscription in there, then that might draw people's attention to, pay for it. But then you can imagine in a year from now, if they go all in on this, them probably catching up to some extent where Siri actually has Scarlett Johansson's actual voice because Apple might actually pay for it. And then, then where do they sit? So I think that the challenge they're going to have is really, as you say, Apple can get access into this deep part of your life, which is you do use these apps to run your life. Like you've got a custom app for the school. I've got an app for my kids' preschool. Having app intents in these things would be genuinely helpful and useful. And I just can't really see these other vendors of models being able to hook into those parts of your life.
Yes, and the context is really important. We've discussed this even prior to the prospect of Apple doing any of this, that one of the big problems with the main models is like getting it up to speed on what you're currently working on, what you're currently doing. And half the time it's like, is it even worth prompting? Because I've got to craft a prompt, get it all the context information, then start asking it questions. And that's where we've always talked about that we see the future as the AI being sort of integrated into apps rather than going off and just using ChatGPT, because there's so much context you need to get there. And similarly, we've discussed the reason we thought GPTs would fail is this idea that I don't want to browse through 7,000 apps to find the one to do the thing that I currently need to do, then provide it with context to actually get stuff done. So it's this situation where the actual orientation of the interface, the fact that it's all there and I can do it there, there's no way I'm going to go off and log into some external service or load a specific app on my phone to do AI stuff when it can just be in context wherever I am. And that's what Apple's done. If you look at sorry to keep going, but if you look at the content writing thing, they're just making it a control that can be enabled by app developers in any text area. So it's like, I'm not going to friggin' go to ChatGPT to generate content when I can do it in the text box in any app I'm in. Like, why would I?
I just would argue that, like, okay, so Copilot in VS Code, right? If you're using that or something similar, I don't use it. I still go to a web-based client like Googling I used to on Stack Overflow and paste my problem in there and say, what is this? My natural workflow is to still go to the AI client, like the actual endpoint of AI, like whatever that interface is, for those like higher level things. And yes, if I'm writing a document and I have a great model built into, say, Google Docs or wherever I'm writing, then cool. But what Apple presented was like opening bloody text edit or pages locally on a Mac and having those controls built in. And I'm just not sure in reality anyone actually uses that stuff.
Yeah, maybe in that scenario it's a bit different. You want something that's a bit more open and not like you just pick some random context to solve it in. But I think for a large amount of cases where AI is going to be used, it makes sense their approach.
I think it works in the Siri paradigm, like where you don't want to go off. You just want one kind of voice to talk to and get things done and have these app intents in your sort of personal life as like a personal assistant. I think when it comes to getting like deep work, like actual partnering with AI to get work done and stay on task, I still think that's going to be like a client like ChatGPT long term that you'll just have a subscription to, and when you go to work, you'll work with. And maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I just don't see any other way it progresses. Like I even in SaaS apps now, when you have AI built in, I still find myself just going to ChatGPT if I'm doing like a Google AdWord or something and saying, hey, what's a good title for this ad? I just want the best model in that case.
Yeah, true.
So I think there was a few other interesting bits. One of the things you said prior to the recording of the show was just how much Apple has benefited from open source. Do you want to explain what you mean by that for listeners that may be unaware that they are certainly standing on the shoulders of others here?
Yeah, so when you look through the way they train the model, the way they set up the smaller model, they used a lot of techniques like LoRa, for example, which is the low rank adaptation that people use to run models on their own devices. So on MacBook Pros, things like that. And so anytime a model comes out, like Llama 3, for example, or Phi 3 or whatever it is, people make these low rank adapt versions of them that is sort of dismiss part of the data. So it's a trade-off between the quality of the answers you get versus being able to run it with less memory, essentially, or at higher speeds. And so Apple has said that they've applied these techniques to the on-device models. Also, they've used human alignment as well as training with synthetic data. Another thing we've seen done in open source smaller models where we saw, for example, smaller sets of really high quality synthetic data giving better results than larger amounts of training. So the reason I bring that up or brought it up to you this morning is because we've discussed like so many times, like why, like with open source, like I sort of get why people do it, but I never understood the benefits for companies in that respect. But you can see here that Apple is probably one of the main beneficiaries so far of all this stuff because they've been able to apply all of these techniques that have been refined by, admittedly they probably participated, but by the community at large, and they've been able to apply it to get an on-device AI that's really good. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see that they sort of go through and acknowledge those techniques in their training methodology.
This is typical Apple, though, isn't it? They go out and they watch what everyone else is doing. They observe for like a year or two, see how everyone's doing things, watch the industry hack their devices to try and run models locally and do all that stuff. And then they just come out of nowhere and they're like, okay, here's how it's all refined. It's well documented. There's nice training videos. You can easily hook it into your existing apps.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to support it. We're going to back it. It's private and secure. They just tick all those boxes. And I think what they've done so well here is they've really honed in on the weak spots of other providers right now, like around that privacy feeling with AI. Like it's a very personal thing, sharing this information. So they want to reassure people that it's super private. They've baked it into areas where AI is good today, like summarization, the whole idea of RAG, or what they call semantic index, where it has all of that view of all the data that's going on your phone, whether it's like photos, emails, chat messages, whatever it is. And then they can, find appropriate context and meaning when you search out of that. So look, I don't want to turn this into some Apple fanboy show because I think I'm on a PC, so like
Yeah, me too, and I use Android. So this isn't me just loving it because it's Apple. I just think the approach they've taken is really good for them and good for the users.
One other thing I'll say, and look, this is me, this is me probably getting a little bit far-fetched. Is one of the demos that they had for the new Mac operating system was this idea that you could load up your phone, whether it's in another room or I think maybe like in the car, like somewhere else, bring up your phone on your Mac and operate the phone even when it was asleep. So you could click into apps, you could use the apps, you do all the phone stuff that you might want to do. And I was thinking, it's kind of useful. Like if you have two-factor authentication and you need to pull that up on your phone, you couldn't be bothered getting your phone, which happens to me all the time. Kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, but still, like you could easily access your phone. And so I thought, there's some cool applications if you're running an app on your phone that you don't necessarily have on your computer, you can use it in context, so that's good. But then I was like, why would you really want this? And then it started making me think, like, what if your phone is primarily interfaced through Siri in the next like 2 to 3 years with app intents? And that phone you can kind of take to your workplace, and it's a secure box for your interaction with AI.
I see,
and so
yeah.
when you're on a computer, you can kind of bring that secure box in, and that secure box can then link up to the computer or other device you're using, and maybe that enables it to sort of power up a little bit, like get access to a better model, adapt to that hardware.
Saying. Yeah, because you the last thing you want, well, I mean, a lot of organizations wouldn't even allow you to have that much personal crap on your work computer, right? But you're so entrenched in that environment and benefiting from the tools that you can't not have it.
Yeah, I just wonder if this is becoming this like AI second brain that you sort of carry. I mean, it already is your second brain, your phone, if you think about Googling stuff, but maybe, that's what's coming. And I'm sure in a year, Android will have copied this structure and cleaned up their image around AI. I think they have a lot of this stuff, and I'd say they're superior in a lot of ways. Like their models are likely better in areas, but I think what Apple's done, which it feels like they are just so good at, is finding the real problems, going and solving them and packaging it up in a nice package, and then everyone else will inevitably duplicate that model. So the final thing I wanted to talk about is, as an Android user, would you, in a year from now, if Siri can do these app intents and all this stuff across multiple apps and tell you when your kid's soccer game is, would you switch over this?
No, and that's the thing, isn't it? Like I just couldn't be bothered. I don't care about phones anymore. I used to get excited about every little release, but I don't know if I'm like the typical everyman that you can judge everything with an N size of 1. But no, I'm too lazy, and it just doesn't seem good enough for me to bother switching.
But
like,
okay. Like, what if it was truly magical? Like Siri just became like hyper intelligent, where you could really get stuff done with it. Like call my kid's school and tell them, we're not coming into
It's just all managing the school administration.
It really is. I don't know why that's my example every time.
It's the biggest problem in life. Look, I don't know. Maybe if it was far superior, I might try it. But I don't know. I'm not really sure.
I want to hear from Android users. If Siri becomes like AGI level with app intents. Actually, let's not say AGI. It's just really good at app intents and understanding your life, and it's basically like Microsoft Recall. But if it's if it gets to that point, would you switch? Because I know Android users are very anti-Apple generally, and let's see. So curious to hear. Now, we were also discussing models, and earlier we touched on this idea that Apple can just sub out any model they want, just like a search engine, where Google famously pays them to be the default search engine on the phones. They make a ton of money from that. And it's been leaked that there's no relationship between Apple and OpenAI where they're exchanging money. It's just like someone compared it on X to an unpaid intern that ChatGPT is, where they're not getting paid, but it's good exposure for your career. Like it's gonna be great.
Yeah.
So when we were like discussing this model, this stuff, we were saying, well, is the end user really going to care if they're not using the best model? Like the general user, like obviously for us that are writing code or people that are doing research or, high levels of creativity where they need these models. But are the models that Apple can provide on the phone where they're just running locally and they're super cheap and fast, is that going to be enough? And are these small models the future? Like we talk about this idea of AI function calling, and you said to me before the show this idea of once a problem's solved, you need a better model. So I'm just curious if you think that's now the path that everyone's going to follow, small models that solve problems really well, or the frontier foundational models is still going to be the way forward.
Yeah, well, this is the thing I keep coming back to is the latest model is great to try, and we all want to have the best thing. But there's so many problems that once AI can do it, it can't do it any better than doing it fully. So, like, for example, let's say it's taking your personal context information and filling in forms for you. Once it can do that universally, you don't need GPT-10 when it comes out to solve that problem. It's already done. Once you can generate custom emojis, you don't need a new model to generate your custom emojis. There's just so many things that once they reach a certain point, you don't need the latest thing. And I think that also because of the context and convenience of things on the phone, people are just going to use what's there. No one's going to be like, okay, unless I can use OpenAI, I'm not going to bother with this thing. They're just going to use what works. And so I would be really concerned if my only claim to fame was providing a model that other people license or provide in their products, because there's so many alternatives. Like you go on Hugging Face and there's so many variations of so many models that work pretty well. And even when we look at these new live benchmarks and things like that, the difference in the models is quite marginal. And yeah, everyone can cite examples where this model definitely solves this problem better. It's better at maths, it's better at science. But in terms of the question you're asking me here, it just doesn't matter that much. And commercially, a company subbing out a model that they have to pay billions of dollars to and risk some company cutting their lunch, whereas they can just run their own on their own private cloud and provide different guarantees. I just don't see how this benefits OpenAI long term. To me, it's like Apple making the most of the current situation, but there's just no reason for them to stay loyal to OpenAI in the long run. I'd be scared if I was OpenAI unless I had something coming that was so much better than everything else that we're back in the spotlight.
So that was another thing I found really interesting about the Apple announcement, how they decided to benchmark their own models with the adapters, and they specifically compared their Apple on device plus adapter for that specific task they compared it to Phi 3 Mini, which was really interesting. I guess that's the most comparable model. But if you look at these benchmarks, what's interesting is they talk about they didn't really think that the benchmarks were that helpful to solving a user's problem. So they ranked these by human satisfaction scores, because then they were like, that's really solving the problem in terms of if the person's happy with the result of that particular task, then that's the best benchmark. So you can see I've got up on my screen, and for those listening, I'll explain it. Apple on device plus adapter for email. That's email summarization. The satisfaction was greater by about 10% or more. Or more. About 14% than Phi 3 Mini, which is the Microsoft on-device model. And then for notification summary, summarization, not as big of a jump, but they were 3% better. So it's interesting also that they're just focusing on the end user satisfaction for that particular task, which shows why people won't actually care about the underlying model in a way. They just want the problem solved.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, the models, that I made this comment to you earlier, it's almost becoming like internet access. Like I might have fiber and you might have cable, or someone has, like some Starlink or something like that. But at some point it just does the job and you don't really think about it anymore. It's just another tool, another thing that you just have around that does that bit, and it's what you use it for and what difference it makes in your life or in your experience that actually matters to you, rather than which connection you have.
I think the most interesting thing is to like, they know it's unsettling right now to have your brand attached to one of these, frontier foundation models, whatever you want to call them, because people are just going to poke and prod like they did with Google's Gemini to get it to do dumb stuff to be clickbait on the internet. And Apple clearly don't want that. So that's another thing they've done in the short term until they get better steerability on their own model, I think, and said, oh, like Siri will just go to ChatGPT and we're going to make it very clear that you're now getting an answer from ChatGPT and yada, yada. So it's
so they can blame it. Meanwhile, they're building up some training data and alignment data for their own models so they won't make the same mistakes.
Yeah, I just kind of wonder how long, if ever, we'll be able to have those creative conversations with a Siri, if they'll ever do that to their brand. Like, if they'll ever actually take the risk there. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, and as much as I've been very complimentary to Apple on all of this, I sort of reserve my judgment for when I actually try it, because the day that Siri actually does something useful, I'll be really surprised.
Yeah, I think everyone's just pretty pumped right now that Siri may actually work for the first time in a long time. And that seems to have added about 360 billion in valuation to Apple.
Yeah, well, that helps.
I don't really get the reasoning of the market. I know there is no reasoning, but they mentioned ChatGPT integration. It's like, all right, next day, 360 billion. I do, though, agree. I think they're on the right path here. Like, this could rebirth them and get people to upgrade. Like, if Siri does get good in a year, there could be, an absolute buy cycle in terms of their phones. And whether or not this does become the second brain in your life with AI, maybe that's a renaissance for the iPhone or whatever devices come after that. All right, so moving on to the other hype on the internet about AI is LumaLabs. Now, for listeners, long-term listeners of the show, you might remember LumaLabs. I'm going to bring it up on the screen now. They first released this 3D character model. Do you remember this, where you could create sort of 3D objects? That was their model called Genie.
No, I don't remember it at all.
There's so much happens. But this was Genie, to bring everyone up to speed, that LumaLabs first release. That was some time ago now, probably 2 weeks ago, but I think it was a year ago or more. And so they came out with Dream Machine. I think Dream Machine was a pretty good name. And Dream Machine is sort of like OpenAI's Sora in that you can create videos. But one of the cool things you can do with it, which is certainly getting a lot of pickup online, is this idea that you can take an existing image and turn it into a short video. So, of course, the first thing the internets have done here is turned it into a meme machine. So they've taken all the famous memes like Giga Chad, the distracted boyfriend, distracted boyfriend, sorry, but then the video goes into the aftermath of what might have happened where the girlfriend's annoyed. It's not the best video ever. They took the Apple Supermom flying example where Apple demoed an image of a mother dressed up as a superhero and they've animated that. There's that girl, Disaster Girl, where the firefighters walk over. It just brings these memes, I guess, to life. Not sure in the commercial value of that. Then there's also a bunch of artists and creatives that were given access to Dream Machine where they've taken Mid-Journey images and put together film clips or video clips with some of their best picks. Some of it's pretty amazing stuff. Like the cherry-picked examples of this thing are really good.
Well, I mean, you say cherry-pick, but I've seen enough examples just myself that there's a lot of cherries to pick. Like it seems like there's a lot of really good results that don't have artifacts and look pretty credible.
And I've got to give full credit here to LumaLabs. I mean, you can actually use it. You can use it. It's not like Sora. It's not fantasy. It's not like Kling where you've got to become a communist. Like you can actually, have a Chinese phone number. But you can actually use it. And so I think, I think that's why these things get so much pickup. I thought one commercial application of it that was super interesting, at least with where the technology's at today, is for the obvious one, like e-commerce images, taking static images and animating them. And that Levels IO over on X showed an example where using his product Photo AI, he's able to place himself in a scene, with whatever clothing he kind of chooses in that regard. And then now he's able to use LumaLabs to animate that image. So it looks like he's walking around in that outfit in that scene. So you can imagine this being incredibly useful if you're selling products online. So I think there are some interesting applications of it as well. There was also this cinematic piece I showed you, and you said, I forget what your reaction was, but it was pretty funny at the time.
Well, I think the thing is, I'm always like you, trying to think of practical applications for things or commercial applications and things like that. But sometimes, and I realized it with this one, you've just got to stop and say, that's amazing. Like, you can take a photo and turn it into a realistic looking video of whatever the hell is in that photo. That's absolutely mind-blowingly amazing. And whether or not I can think of a valid use for it, it's just amazing that that's possible.
But I think I kind of get you that just the longer we do this show and the longer we talk about this stuff, I sort of think about the staying power of this stuff as well. Like, is this going to stick around, and are these technologies going to be developed to their fullest? And you look at something like LumaLabs, and it can't be VC subsidized forever. Like, we saw that when we lived in San Francisco with Sprig, which used to be a food delivery service, where we would get these meals delivered in like 6 seconds for $6 or something. And they were delicious. And then over time, as the VC dollars fell off, the price went up, the service went down, and then it exploded. And you sort of see these image startups and think the same thing. Like, I hope they make money, because I would like to see this technology
I still
progress.
remember there was one where you would take a photo of what you wanted to post for some unknown reason. Then some dude would ride over on a bike, take what you wanted to post, and then package it up and send it. And their profit model idea was that they would make money by getting discounts from the post office. And so then my wife used it to send 200 Christmas cards. So they had to individually put them in envelopes and stamp them. And they're like, guys, this isn't in the spirit of what we're trying to do. Like, VC money subsidized Christmas cards. Thanks,
we're definitely
guys.
in the, what was that one called? I forget.
Ship. SHYP.
We're definitely in that phase right now.
We used to call it Shipe just to annoy them.
Yeah. Anyway.
They failed.
Okay. So.
Not because of me, just to be clear.
Do you know what's funny? When I think they were still in business, but towards the end, when I was moving back from San Francisco to Australia, and I remember doing like an enormous amount, like to the point where you would feel guilty when they would come to your door to pick up
it just
stuff.
Never made sense that someone would come to post like a $5 item. Like, it just, anyway, just crazy stuff. I mean, I guess that's your point, right? Like, VCs will fund stuff because they think that there's a chance it'll go big or get acquired or whatever. Like, if, on the 10-to-1 shot that this thing pays off, it's going to pay off 100-to-1. So it's worth it. But some of this AI stuff, like, for everything you see, like this Luma, there's like 3 or 4 you can try on Hugging Face right now that do something similar. They're not as good, not even close to as good, but it's kind of hard to defend in a way, especially when there's no way to make money from it in the short term.
We were going to talk about it later, but we may as well sort of cut over to it now. This idea of, like we saw Mistral obviously with a big fundraise this week. Again, I think the valuation's now like $6 billion. And you asked me the question, you're like, how are they going to compete? Like, how is this thing expected to compete when you've got like the big models? Like how are you going to even use them when there's already open source alternatives for on-device?
Well, and they also provide a very good open source version of their model, which in a lot of ways is more appealing than their commercial offering, because you can run it on your own secure hardware that you trust. So in a lot of ways, they're competing with themselves in the respect that if I was going to recommend a business use it, I'd be like, run it yourself. Then it stays the same. Then you can control it and it's more secure. So I just, and I guess the same point I made earlier, that like, yeah, you can swap Mistral in for a while if it's the cheapest and it's giving you great results, or you can fine tune it or whatever. But then something else comes along and I can also swap it out. Like, I guess the question I had for you is like, what do the investors think they're investing in?
I just think at the moment it's really hard to acquire companies in the US. So a lot of what's happening is these bigger tech companies know that innovation can happen much quicker in smaller teams that are not attached to the corporate overlord. And so they're essentially just well-funded research labs that are public and have some public products that eventually will be acquired or snapped up over time.
Well, that's right. And I think the other thing is that the VCs play the game of they don't really care if the company makes money. They just care that it's a higher valuation when they sell out their holding, right? So the guys running the company probably don't care because they've got billions of dollars to buy their H100s, H200s, whatever. Then the VCs don't care because they're just hoping to sell it to the next sucker along the way at a massive profit, and then someone down the line has to figure out how they get a final return on it, whether
It
that's
seems like
talent
the
or whatever.
biggest opportunity for Mistral though is like there's going to be products like I'm sure like your smart fridge or whatever will have small models in it, and there's going to be a lot of companies that don't have the talent or the willpower to get the technologies into their devices. So like Apple's doing with the smaller models, maybe this becomes a trend. And the business opportunity is similar to sort of like WordPress Enterprise, where obviously anyone can use WordPress, but if you want to work with WordPress, they'll provide a hosted managed service. I think that's probably the
Imagine the Mistral
strategy.
guys up there with the PowerPoint presentations like, guys, the future is fridges. Like this is where we're going. With your $1 billion, we will dominate the smart fridge industry.
I bet I am willing to place a big bet on this. In the next year, we will see a smart fridge with a 7 billion parameter local run model. I don't know exactly what it'll do. Maybe it'll have a camera that looks into the fridge and tells you what items are in there at any given time.
That would work. I like that.
Yeah, it's going to happen. And so I just wonder if like these models are just going to be
It's
licensed.
all going to converge
and
around fridges.
it always comes back to the fridge. One thing before we kind of moved on, but I'm cheating a little bit. I want to come back to LumaLabs because I showed some really cherry picked examples myself and really high quality examples. But people in our Discord community have also been sharing some of their examples using it, and so this one is a lady walking along the promenade next to the Mary Leon in Singapore. It's raining and she has a cute dog beside her. Just as a bit of a reality check on this stuff. She appears to be walking on water. She has no hand, and there's dogs that are walking across the water. Although it does look like Singapore, I'll give them full credit. I just had that on the screen and had to share it because it's too funny. I also did some stuff with Jeffrey Hinnon, but I don't think I'm going to share it because people seem to get offended when I do.
Yeah, we can't do stacks on anymore. We got to pick someone else to pick on.
All right, so I think we should come back to that discussion on Mistral because I do want to talk about OpenAI's revenue and how this all sort of fits together. But before we do, I think it is worth mentioning, finally, Stability AI released something after they got rid of their CEO. So announcing the open release of Stable Diffusion 3 Medium. So this isn't the best version of Stable Diffusion 3 that they have. Our most sophisticated image generation model to date. That's questionable. But what's interesting and why I wanted to bring it up, Stable Diffusion 3, is it is a much smaller model and seems to have a similar output quality when you prompt it right as to Stable Diffusion 2 XL, which is what we currently use on SimTheory, and I think is probably one of the best image models out there outside of Midjourney. So it's suitably sized to run on consumer PCs, laptops, things like that. I would suspect it's what the Copilot Plus PCs are running because they did say they're running Midjourney. So I'm assuming it is this Stable Diffusion 3 Medium model. The licensing is pretty interesting as well. So the weights are available. So this can be completely tweaked to your liking. It's an open, non-commercial license though, so you can't commercialize it, but it does come under their creator license program, which is, I think, probably one of the fairest licensing models out there if you want to use Stability stuff. So an interesting release. My first, first impressions of the cherry-picked examples of Stable Diffusion 3 were just incredible. Like I thought it looked amazing. I was like, smaller model, can't wait. Then I tried it with some of the prompts I've been using on SimTheory because I've got those saved so I could easily rerun them. And it was a pretty big disaster, really. Like the quality's there, the text generation capabilities seem far better than anything I've seen before from them. But yeah, again, over on Discord, people have been sharing their works from this. This is something that Josh shared
That's a good
with the
one.
Discord, and it's a woman's head lying on grass with a deformed hand coming out of it, which says SD3 sucks. Admittedly, the quality of the text is pretty good, and that grass, wow, very realistic. Not so much the woman.
It's interesting.
I'm sure it's just going to take time for people to figure out how to prompt it. And I think one of the things with LumaLabs and Stable Diffusion 3, this release, is it just takes people time to figure out how to use it. And I honestly think the productization of these things comes from the prompting and putting it in a suitable product. Like you saw from that photo AI example where, he's in an outfit kind of walking around that, you can essentially create yourself as a virtual model, make yourself look more professional and better, put yourself in great clothes, and now animate yourself. And so he obviously has prompting techniques to get that to reliably work in his app.
And there's a lot of parameters you can tune and different things you can try. Like when a new model gets released, there's a lot of time before you're going to get the most out of it. And I think that, you do need someone to take the time to work through it for specific cases to get something good. I mean, you see it on Midjourney as well. I mean, it's pretty good out of the box, but that community is so alive with people who are developing new techniques of prompting to get the best out of it. It's a whole art form in itself.
All right, so moving back to the big tech proxy war with AI labs, OpenAI's revenue was leaked. Well, not really leaked. I mean, Sam Altman apparently in a town hall or an all hands actually stood up and told everyone what the revenue was and then leaked. The information reported OpenAI's annualized revenue doubles to 3.4 billion since late 2023. It's very impressive. I mean, that growth is truly insane from the moment they launched. It says most of the revenue is from OpenAI's subscriptions and API access. A lot of people online are speculating that it's roughly I think this is just a guess, 40% ChatGPT subscriptions, 40% API, and then probably 20%, maybe 15% from the enterprise use cases. So they're really interestingly downplaying the enterprise use case. And I think the weight of the consumer business is probably a lot better than I thought. What blows my mind about this, though, is remember, they just made GPT-4o free, essentially free with rate limiting online without even logging in, I'm pretty sure. So it shows that they're not even trying to convert people into paying customers. And if it truly represents 40% of that number, the potential just in the consumer subscriptions alone for growth is just wild, like absolutely wild in terms of how big this business could be. And it seems people are willing to pay it. They have strong retention numbers from what's rumored as well. And I think that links and ties in really nicely to what I was saying earlier about this Ethan Mollick tweet around some recent research. I think it was from CNBC that did this research. 3 out of 4 people use AI at work. 75% people are already using AI at work. 46% of them started using it less than 6 months ago. So you can sort of see, again, to that AI relationship I was talking about with the iPhone earlier, this idea that, people are willing to have their own subscription to these services or pay for it out of their own pocket to empower them to be better at work, in their personal life, and potentially in the future, as it gets smarter and it knows you better, just to be your AI companion. I think this is probably like one of the biggest markets for it. Like this subscription is real. People are paying for it. People are using it. And this is like the most obvious use case of using AI.
Yeah, well, and I think it really backs up what we said earlier about people may not want to admit it, but they're using it all the time for everything. And it's just a daily companion now. And since OpenAI was out there first, ChatGPT is the most well known. I think for a lot of people, they probably aren't even aware of the other options. Anyone I've shown Claude to prefers it, but so few people know about it.
Yeah, and with this Apple integration, just from a marketing point of view as well, like ChatGPT is now, it's like, it's a hard thing to say. Like, I Googled it, I ChatGPT'd it. It's not the best, but
all the voice to text things go ChatGPT like every time. I don't know why.
So it was interesting though in education. This report also touched on that. Let me find it and bring it up. About half of teachers, students, and parents are using AI chatbots at least once a week for work or school. Teachers once a week or more, 49%. I mean, that's nuts in terms of that adoption. K-12 students, same, 49%. Undergraduates, 49%.
So the teachers are writing the assignments using ChatGPT. The kids are writing the answers using ChatGPT. The teachers are evaluating them using ChatGPT, then writing the kids' report using ChatGPT. That's education.
Talk about lock-in.
It might as well just conduct it all itself and we just sit at home and do nothing.
Soon. But so the story around this, or the topic I wanted to bring up around it, is this idea that it is, I would say, one of the best use cases outside of code gen, summarization, and some of these other use cases we talk about on this show quite a bit, is this idea of learning a topic that you know nothing about and having it as a teaching companion as you learn, and just someone, as you said, who just knows everything about that topic to be able to, give you a really good understanding of it. And when we first started doing this show, one of the things we wanted to do was provide listeners of the show a way to experience a lot of the AI technologies we were trying in the console or locally on our computer, knowing how to write code and set up environments and quite honestly have access to a lot of this stuff. And so we built Sim Theory, and look, it's not the greatest front-end experience in the world. I swear it's about to get a lot better. But I hadn't actually sat and written code for probably a decade. I wasn't up to date on anything. And I found in the early days of working on that project, I was really heavily leaning on ChatGPT, and that was like when it wasn't even as good as it is today, to help me learn things or relearn things again and be able to ask questions, which I traditionally in the past probably would have just asked you and annoyed the hell out of you. But I was able to ask it, get it to, and from just repeatability or parroting almost, get to an ability now where I find myself relying on it less and less, and I feel like my skills are sort of beyond needing to rely on it. I mean, I still do use it occasionally, but it's more like trying to find where I've mistyped a character or something like that.
Or as we said earlier, where kind of a module you want or something, and you just get it to write it in full for you to save some time.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you've got a class and you want to write a pretty repetitive method or something has been done a million times before, you can just ask it to write it, and generally it will do a good job of that. I think where it falls down, and we talked about this as well, is like, if you have a really complex problem and you go down one path with it and that path is just wrong, it seems to just get deeper and deeper into the weeds of that, like the wrong solution, where you have to sort of naturally back up, start a new session with whatever system you're using and say, hey, let's try again, but give it some pointers as to which path to go down. So you definitely partnering with it and problem solving with it. And in those cases, I actually find it worse than my brain just figuring it out myself. So I think that's where it falls down. But I guess my overarching point in terms of education is, if you think about education, right, it's you're sort of you're reading, you're interpreting, you're parroting, you're experimenting with the output of whatever it is that you've been learning with, getting coaching and feedback on it, and then you eventually you reach a point where you're probably better than the teacher if you're a kid. Like kids generally are getting smarter and smarter over the years with access to these technologies. And I sort of feel like that, not that I'm necessarily saying you get smarter than the AI, but in terms of your ability as a human right now to problem solve when it comes to, say, something like coding, you typically are better at these things like reasoning and problem solving. And so I would argue like it's a transformative educational tool. And that's why we're seeing it being used so heavily in education today, because like it's mind-blowing what it's been able to help me do. let alone you can imagine kids growing up with this technology, what it's going to allow them to do.
And there'd be lots of cases of access to teachers as well. Because, in some cases you think, okay, you just get a private tutor in whatever subject you want to specialize in. But there'd be so many people out there who do not have access to a good teachers. And therefore, having access to a teacher of sorts that knows all the stuff and can educate you in a way and at a pace that suits you is extremely valuable. I mean, it's kind of a revolution in a way in terms of education if you know how to use it correctly, which I mean, even if it's just asking it basic questions, that might be enough.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people say, "Oh, AI is a bubble," and what are the real use cases? And I think there is bubble elements out there, like we were talking about with the food delivery and ship it joke earlier. Well, not joke. I mean, these were real examples, but you look at something like LumaLabs, and you're like, unless these guys find commercial applications of this technology or just get acquired, like this thing maybe is indicative of a bubble in some sense. So I think there's elements like that, but I think there's a real unique moment where LLMs aren't going away. They're going to be foundational to future education, that on-device personalization, how you use technology in your device. And we are just starting to see it being baked in at a core OS level. And that it brings me back to the Apple Intelligence example, where it just fundamentally now is something that it is the future, it's coming, and I'm curious to see how it like pans out with Apple. So one thing I wanted to cover is this new benchmark that came out during the week. It's called Live Bench Benchmark, the hottest in benchmark technologies.
Sounds great.
What initially drew my attention to it is Jan LeCun is one of the co-authors of Live Bench. And what's interesting about it is a lot of people were speculating that a lot of the models now are just trained on the benchmarks to try and out benchmark each other and get the attention with their announcement. And so Live Bench hopes to solve that. And it's a benchmark design for LLMs that is designed to free itself of contamination. And the way they do that is they just keep changing the questions every month, as well as using some of the recent released data sets that are publicly available, news articles, and things like that.
But if they change the questions, how can you benchmark against a previous period of time?
I think it's a trend over time, isn't it?
But wouldn't it make, like, if you change the questions, it could make the model seem worse now than it was before?
Potentially, yeah. But I think that's maybe because the models are changing all the time. I think we'd need to clarify that. I wish you didn't ask that. Now I look like an idiot.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I guess I should have looked in more detail before I asked the question, but it seems to me like, I guess if they're all being judged by the same criteria at the same time, that makes sense. But some sets of questions might favor others more than others. And so I don't know. It's a really tricky problem to solve.
Oh, so
These
it's
are
an
smart
average.
people
It's an average over time. That's how it
Yeah.
works. So that makes sense. So it says Live Bench is designed to limit potential contamination by releasing new questions monthly, as well as having questions based on recently released data sets, papers, news articles, and movie synopsises. I don't know why that is the thing. Each question
movies
has
are the key.
verifiable, objective, ground truth answers, allowing hard code questions to be scored accurately and automatically. So one of the complaints about a lot of the current benchmarks is they use the best model, GPT-4, to judge the answers of other models. So it's somewhat biased in that regard. It's got 18 diverse tasks across 6 categories, and they'll release new, harder tasks over time. So right now, if you look at the actual leaderboard with this, I was saying to you, the reason I thought it was interesting is the leaderboard represents my current feeling about using the LLMs, like where I think they actually stack up. So you've got GPT-4o at the top, GPT-4 Turbo below it, but very close. I think it does better at reasoning average, which I again think aligns to my experience using them. Claude 3 Opus is up there, and then you've got some other of the GPT-4 Turbo preview models. Gemini 1.5 Pro. That's the one I'm a little bit iffy about, and I think we should talk about your developer experience with that in a moment. Then you've got Mistral Large, Claude 3 Sonnet, Qwen 2, 72 billion. That makes sense to me. It's weird though, because some of the authors of this were people from Facebook, and um, Meta's Llama 370 billion instruct just gets absolutely hammered on this. But I actually find using it pretty good. Like I would place it higher than they have.
Yeah, me too. I have really good experiences with it. It's fast as anything and it gives great results.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with being served up by Grok, though, just that it's just so fast.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So yeah, an interesting benchmark. We'll certainly follow it, and I think as new models get released, try and refer back to this live bench model, because we have been complaining about this for a while, that the benchmarks are sort of, a lot of people are trying to just hack the benchmark here. So I mentioned with Gemini that we'll get to that in a moment. Let's get to that now. So we've been implementing a lot of the newer features of Gemini into the new sim theory. Do you want to talk about like what those features are, and then just the complexity of adding them? I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things in the old sim theory, we did a lot of things ourselves because the technologies didn't exist when we were doing it. So function calling, for example, we had our own way of doing function calling that where before it existed in the models as like tool calling things. And so that was part of the reason we had a bit of slowness and other things there, because like there's that extra layer that you've got to get through. And the other things were like when we analyze audio and video, it would be a process of speech to text, and then using that text either in a RAG context or directly inserting it into the context. Whereas now some of the models are truly multimodal. So for example, GPT-4o, when you now upload images into the new sim theory and you do inference on the images, it's being done in a properly multimodal way. So the images are part of the query, as well as the text associated with that. The same with Anthropic, with Claude Opus, and the same with other models that support it. So the big thing about Gemini, that their big pitch is that it can do hours of video and hours of audio, and you can query that. So I've been implementing that natively so we can actually experience that for ourselves. And so I did that, and the experience of doing it was atrocious because, first of all, I don't know if I'm stupid, and there's a chance I am, but finding the actual documentation for how to implement the audio and video for Gemini is extremely difficult. The way I ended up doing it was finding they have some GitHub repo for Python that that had a couple of snippets of code as examples in there that I copied and pasted, and then they gave errors, and then I sort of had to iterate. But essentially, the way I ended up implementing it was literal trial and error, where I would just send any old garbage in the request to their endpoints and then see what errors I got. And I gradually derived the JSON structure of how they expected the data. So, for example, when you pass the audio in, they give an example where, send it as a file object or as a blob or something like that, and then there's like an inline data key, and within that you've got to give like a MIME type and then the data. But it was unclear, is the data base 64 encoded or is it raw data or whatever, and it's just totally unclear in their docs what the hell it's supposed to be. And so in the end, I had to split it into these parts, and like it was epically complicated, but you can't find on their official docs anywhere the docs on how to do it. And my point was that we're literally talking about billion-dollar wars between these massive companies, like billions of dollars between Apple, Google, Microsoft, all these companies. And yet the investment in the developer experience by Google is so low. And it isn't just Google. A lot of them are like this, where you can't find single complete examples of how to do it. Like literally, Google does not have a single complete example of how to, in any language, take a video and run inference on it. There's none. There's snippets, but they don't work like without severe modification. It just blows my mind that they would go to all this trouble, have all these conferences and developer things and talk about the future, and they don't even give a single code example of how to use the thing.
It made me really question, is anyone actually using this stuff? Like, I'm kind of like, if they were using it, surely you would hear more about this.
Well, and that's the thing. You then search Google or you search forums or whatever for like other people running into this issue, and there's barely anything. Like there's really little out there on people actually using it. I mean, I know a lot of this stuff goes on in Discord communities, and probably there's a bunch of enthusiastic people in there who can answer your questions. But the fact that they can't even employ they could just employ 2 full-time docs people just to write docs and examples. That's all you'd need. A couple of employees, a few $100,000, and you would have way more participation. And then even as it happened, I hit another error where I tried uploading one of our podcast videos. Like I just ripped it from YouTube and tried to upload it to get it to do chapter headings, because that's one of the things we wanted to try. And it's like, you cannot have a video with more than 3,600 frames. And I'm like, hang on, this is the same company that was saying you can upload hours of video and run inference on it. But I uploaded a 1-hour podcast and it can't do that.
Yeah, I wonder if it's some limitations on our account or not, or something.
But this is the thing, right? Like, I don't know what the issue is. Like, is it something I've done wrong? Do I need to downgrade the quality of the video? Like, it literally is just a text-based error message saying too many frames. Like, that's it. You Google that error, there's nothing. There's just no documentation on any of it. It's astonishing that there's so little support for something that's so ostensibly important to the company.
What's the bet someone leaves in the comments on YouTube? Like, you didn't go to AI Studio Pro plus Doc Center. I
tried pretty hard, like I really looked around pretty hard. So like, if it does exist, it's really poorly done because I tried, like I'm a programmer. I have been for many years. I know how to find stuff. It's if it's out there, it's poorly done.
Speaking of things that are poorly done, Microsoft has officially killed Copilot GPT Builder after just 3 months, according to VentureBeat. It will be retired soon. I never even was able to access it. I think it was to pro subscribers paying for the consumer version of Copilot Pro.
Yeah, I tried to access it too and never could.
Yeah,
it was really unclear.
$30 a month. It was in that phase where Copilot was just sort of like mimicking OpenAI's ChatGPT features. So we had the GPTs come out from OpenAI and then quickly followed by Microsoft saying we have them too. They, of course, have their enterprise Copilot GPT builder still that's a lot more advanced, and there's like a drag and drop sort of studio builder thing in there. I have a few thoughts about this. I think one thing is the GPT concept is just shit. But then my actual more thoughtful comment about it is the GPT concept, I think, can solve a lot of problems. For example, in a company like ours doing a lot of RFPs, you could have like an RFP GPT that helps you fill in RFPs. You can have a knowledge base for the company that has a bunch of stuff in it. So I can totally see in the enterprise sense or the mid-market sense, feature gating this to those examples with Copilot makes a ton of sense. I think from the consumer point of view, they just don't have much traction. Like I know some people say they use them quite a lot, but I kind of have the same feeling about ChatGPT's GPTs. I just don't think they add much value. If you could quickly switch between the contexts in line, maybe that would help, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I feel the same. Look, I don't begrudge Microsoft for this at all. They're trying a lot of stuff. A lot of what they're doing is working. There's nothing wrong with putting something out there, realizing it's not going to work and pulling it early. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
It's worked out well for Google.
Yeah, well, I mean, Google's worse because they have a history of doing that and you can't trust them. But I think there's nothing wrong with this. And sorry, I also agree with you that just fundamentally that concept isn't quite right yet. And there needs to be a better approach for that kind of thing for companies and for individuals. Like this idea of having like hundreds of different apps for everything you can think of was never going to work. And we said that at the time. It's not like we've changed our opinion too much on that. So this makes sense to me that they're ending it, and it was never really going to work.
What do you think the future of OpenAI's GPT store and builder and all that stuff is.
I
Given
think just
this.
abandonware. I think that I don't know if they ever followed through on their revenue share thing or what, but it just doesn't seem like we discussed at the time. People are going to go there as a destination and look for some random app that just happens to solve the problem they happen to have at the time. It makes much more sense to have an overall AI router thing like we discussed with Siri earlier, where these abilities exist and these procedures exist and these different apps exist within the context of the AI, and that when the time is right, the AI will suggest using a particular procedure to solve a problem, like formatted input, formatted output, that kind of thing. But I think the idea of like browsing for AI based apps is not a thing that's going to be useful for anyone, because there's too many possibilities. There's too many things it can do. You just can't possibly make an app for every little thing.
Yeah, and I think this is again where the Apple intelligence reigns supreme to me with the app intents. Like you don't have to go and build all these things. They already exist. You just have to expose those app intents and that gives you a lot of capabilities. But
Yeah.
for me, the GPT builder, the only thing I think it's good at is if each GPT, has memory and you might want a context switch where the GPT thinks it's a doctor or an accountant or things like that. I think that's where it works quite well, where it stays in some form of character play and you tend to get better results doing it. But whether that needs a store, I'm not sure. Like if I
Yeah,
could
I
just
agree. I
switch.
think that is an excellent use for it. And we know because we do it all the time in sim theory and it works great. But I just think, yeah, like you don't really want to go, okay, now I'm going to go talk to this personality. You need a much faster and better way of switching between them, or ideally combining them together.
Yeah, like I don't want my medical history memory shared with my AI generalist day-to-day worker thing. It's just
Yeah, it's
weird.
almost like object oriented encapsulation, right? Like the data exists within that agent and you can get to it via accessor methods, like by asking it questions or interrogating it or calling its functions or whatever. But you don't want that raw data just mixed in with everything else.
Yeah, so I don't know if that'll like die a death. I think there are other opportunities around an AI store for ChatGPT, just like working with all the people that use their products, like powered by ChatGPT or whatever. Like how Apple has like an official accessory sort of label. I wonder if they could go down that route and have a store where it just links off to actual web applications or even iOS apps that use ChatGPT and recommend different apps and just charge on some sort of like have like a login with OpenAI sort of thing, and it builds back to your OpenAI account as opposed
Yeah,
to
I mean,
in that
Apple
app.
has zero incentive to do any of that.
Oh, I'm not suggesting Apple would. I just mean
Oh,
OpenAI do at a web-based level. Like they could own that ecosystem. I mean, Facebook Connect, like log in with Facebook. That really helped them have staying power. So I think that could be one option with it. But it does seem like unless GPTs become actual apps that are useful, then I doubt it. And I think Apple with Apple Intelligence has probably shown them the model here. And the winners, at least in this phase, will go to big tech where they control your life in a device.
yeah.
Any final thoughts on the week that is Apple Intelligence? It's no longer this day in AI, it's this day in Apple Intelligence.
Yeah, I do feel like the first half was definitely an ad for Apple, but I also think that they've had a really good approach here. I mean, time will tell as to the implementation. I think Apple's just lucky to have a good reputation of actually following through on things and maybe not being the best at stuff, but they execute so well that everybody ends up using it.
Chris, I'm not going to make a prediction around it. When do you think we're going to get the new Sim Theory beta to users? When
I
is that
think, I
going to
mean, we're
happen?
using it now, right? I think next week we can let in people who are already paid subscribers to start using what we have. And then we're just going to be releasing improvements as we have them.
Yeah, so that hopefully will be our goal. Hopefully we'll have something to do next week. I think I've said that the last like 3
We say
weeks.
it every week.
It'll
It's
come
tradition
eventually.
now.
It'll come up. We should just say nothing and then release it when it's ready. But we're an AI company. You have to talk about imagine when.
Yeah,
Imagine
we
if.
just got our first $1 billion investment as well. So that's really going to help.
Yeah, it's a $30 billion valuation, and we also ship products. All right, that was fun. I enjoyed talking about that. I thought Apple Intelligence, it's very interesting. It'll be certainly fun to actually play with it. You won't get to play with it because you're going to stick in the Android ecosystem.
That's right. I'll enjoy it by proxy.
All right. Thanks again for listening. We appreciate all the support. We will see you again next week. Goodbye.